The summer heat in Crescent Grove had a way of clinging to your skin, like a constant reminder that school was out and responsibility could take a back seat. My friends and I had been looking forward to these weeks of freedom all year long. It was supposed to be simple, just us, a secluded cabin by the lake, and a stack of snacks big enough to last through our late-night gaming sessions. But now, as I sit here recounting everything that happened, I realize how naive we were to think that this trip would be anything like the carefree summers we imagined. Emma had invited us to her family's old cabin, tucked deep in the woods where the only signs of civilization were the distant hum of the highway and the occasional plane overhead. The cabin was charming, in a way. Weathered wood framed the structure, giving it a rustic look, and the smell of pine surrounded it like a natural shield against the outside world. Inside, it was all cozy furniture and dim lighting, the kind of place that felt like it had secrets if you stayed quiet long enough to listen. Jake, Ryan, Lily, and I arrived in a whirlwind of excitement. Jake, ever the joker, immediately started with his antics, pretending the cabin was haunted. "This place has axe murderer written all over it," he said, waving a butter knife around for dramatic effect. Lily rolled her eyes, already regretting coming along. Ryan, the quietest of us, just smiled faintly and went to check out the dock by the lake. And me? I was somewhere in between, trying to soak it all in, convinced this would be a summer to remember. That first night, we sat around the fireplace after dinner, laughing over bad horror stories and even worse attempts at roasting marshmallows. The air was warm, the kind of warm that makes you feel drowsy even as your adrenaline keeps you wide awake. It was Emma who brought it up first. "So, I found something weird in the attic," she said, her voice low enough to grab our attention. Jake perked up. "Weird how? Weird like a stash of gold bars, or weird like a creepy doll with a lazy eye?" Emma hesitated, her eyes darting to the staircase as though she expected someone or something to be there. "A Ouija board," she finally said. The word hung in the air, heavier than it should have been. Jake laughed, of course. "Oh, perfect. Nothing bad ever happens with those, right?" Lily, always the cautious one, shook her head immediately. "Nope, not doing that. Do you know how many horror movies start this exact way?" But Jake was already on his feet, heading toward the stairs. "Come on, it's just a game. Don't tell me you actually believe in ghosts." A part of me wanted to stop him. I should have stopped him, but instead I followed, curious despite myself. Emma retrieved the board from a dusty corner of the attic, her face unreadable as she carried it downstairs. It looked like every cliché I'd ever seen in movies. Letters painted in fading black, a cheap planchette with chipped edges. We gathered around the coffee table, candles flickering as we dimmed the lights. Even Lily reluctantly joined us, though she crossed her arms and refused to touch the board at first. Emma was the one to ask the first question. "Is anyone here with us?" The planchette didn't move. We exchanged glances, half expecting Jake to push it as a joke. He didn't. "See? Nothing," he said, leaning back in his chair. But then it moved. A slow, deliberate slide across the board, the sound of wood scraping wood barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The planchette stopped on yes. "Okay, who's doing that?" Jake asked, his voice not as steady as before. No one answered. "Maybe we should stop," Lily whispered, her eyes wide. But none of us did. Something about the moment felt impossible to break, like an invisible thread had tied us all together. Emma asked another question. This time, the response was faster. "Danger." Ryan swallowed hard. "Is this still a joke?" The planchette moved again. "No." And then, as if on cue, the lights flickered. The candles guttered, but didn't go out. Jake jumped to his feet, laughing nervously. "Okay, fun's over. That was weird." But I couldn't look away from the board. My hands felt cold, like the warmth of the room had been sucked out, leaving me frozen in place. Emma tried to laugh it off, but I could see it in her eyes. She was scared. We packed the board away and pretended everything was fine. But as I write this, I can still feel the weight of that planchette in my hands, the way it seemed to pulse with a life of its own. That night, none of us slept well. And in the days that followed, the strange occurrences began. The first signs were easy to dismiss. After all, a creaky cabin in the middle of the woods has its share of quirks. But as the days went on, those quirks became harder to ignore. It started small. Emma swore she had left her phone on the counter, only to find it hours later in the attic, lying inches from where the Ouija board was stored. We laughed it off at first, joking that she must have been sleepwalking, but her face told another story. She didn't believe the explanation any more than we did. Jake was the next to notice something strange. He woke us all up in the middle of the night, pounding on our doors and insisting someone had been standing outside his window. "It wasn't an animal," he hissed, his voice unusually tense. "It was a person. I saw them, just standing there, watching." Ryan went out with a flashlight to investigate, but he came back shaking his head. No footprints, no sign of anyone near the cabin. Jake was convinced, though, and even though we teased him about it, there was something unnerving in the way he kept glancing over his shoulder. By the third day, even Lily was on edge. She had been sitting by the lake alone, sketching in her notebook, when she heard her name whispered from the tree line. At first, she thought it was Jake playing another prank, but when she turned around, no one was there. "It sounded close," she said later, her voice low, almost like she didn't want to say it too loudly, like it was right behind me. That night, we decided to address the elephant in the room. Sitting in the dim glow of the fireplace, Emma finally asked what we were all thinking, but too scared to say out loud. "Do you think it's connected to the board?" Jake scoffed. "Oh, come on. You don't really believe that, do you? It's just a stupid game. Weird stuff happens in old cabins. It's a coincidence." But no one looked convinced, not even Jake himself. It was Ryan who finally spoke up, breaking the heavy silence. "It's not just the board," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's us. We invited it. Whatever it is, it's here because of us." That declaration hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. No one argued with him, because deep down, we all knew he was right. As the hours ticked by, the cabin seemed to shift around us. Shadows danced in the corners, flickering just outside the edges of our vision. Even the sounds of the forest, the chirping crickets, the rustling leaves, felt different, hushed, expectant. We agreed to stick together for the rest of the night. No one wanted to be alone. But despite our pact, sleep was impossible. The cabin's walls felt closer, like they were pressing inward, holding us in. And the whispers, they started again. Faint, indistinct, but unmistakable. This time they weren't just calling Lily's name, they were calling all of ours. By dawn, we were exhausted, our nerves frayed, our faces pale in the soft morning light. But worse than the fatigue was the shared understanding that had settled between us. Something was here with us, and it wasn't leaving, not yet. By the time the third night fell, we were no longer trying to convince ourselves it was all in our heads. Whatever had been set in motion that first night with the Ouija board had grown stronger, more persistent. The cabin no longer felt like a place of refuge, it felt like a trap. Emma was the first to suggest we leave. This thing, whatever it is, isn't just watching us anymore, it's feeding on us. If we stay, we're only making it stronger. Jake, ever the skeptic, shook his head. And do what? Run off into the woods at night? That sounds like a perfect way to make things worse. We stick together. At least here we can face it as a group. Ryan, sitting by the window, turned toward us. His face was pale, his eyes hollow from the sleepless nights. "It's not going to let us go," he muttered. "I can feel it. It's not done with us." None of us argued. Deep down, we all felt it too. The whispers started again as the sun dipped below the horizon. This time they weren't faint or distant. They were loud, clear, and close, voices calling out to us, overlapping, beckoning. Each of us heard something different. For me, it was my mother's voice, soft and comforting, calling my name like she used to when I was a child. For Emma, it was her late grandfather. For Jake, it was his younger brother, who had died years ago. The voices weren't random. They were calculated, designed to lure us. "We can't listen to it," Lily said, clutching the sketchbook she hadn't put down since the whispers first started. "It knows how to get inside our heads. Don't let it." But even as she said it, her eyes darted toward the door, her resolve wavering. The cabin itself seemed to come alive as the night deepened. Doors slammed shut on their own, windows rattled in their frames, the lights flickered violently before plunging us into complete darkness. We lit candles, but their weak flames barely pushed back the oppressive shadows. That was when we decided to confront it. Ryan grabbed the Ouija board from the attic, his hands trembling as he set it down in the middle of the room. If we called it here, he said, his voice shaking, then maybe we can make it go away. The plan was simple. Use the board to demand that it leave us alone. But as we sat around the board, fingers trembling on the planchette, the air grew colder, heavier, as if the cabin itself was holding its breath. "Who are you?" Emma asked, her voice barely a whisper. The planchette began to move, slow at first, then faster. Weseeyu. Jake's face twisted in fear, but he refused to let go. "What do you want?" Stay. The word hung in the air like a threat. We knew then that this wasn't a spirit we could reason with. It didn't want us to leave. It wanted us to stay, to join it. The candles flickered violently before going out, plunging us into darkness again. That's when the screams started, not ours, someone else's. Loud, anguished cries that echoed through the cabin. The walls seemed to vibrate with the sound, and a forceful wind tore them, scattering papers and knocking over furniture. In the chaos, Lily screamed. When we turned to her, she was pointing at the corner of the room, her face frozen in terror. "It's there!" she shrieked. We couldn't see it, but we could feel it, a presence so overwhelming it was suffocating. It felt ancient, malevolent, and utterly beyond our comprehension. Ryan grabbed the board and hurled it into the fireplace. The flames roared to life, consuming the board instantly. For a moment, the cabin fell silent. We held our breath, hoping, praying that it was over. But the silence didn't last. The whispers returned, louder than ever, and the shadows in the room began to coalesce into something solid. We didn't wait to see what would happen next. Without a word, we bolted out of the cabin and into the woods, running as fast as our legs could carry us. The forest was pitch black, the trees seeming to close in around us. The whispers followed, echoing in the darkness, growing fainter but never fully disappearing. When we finally reached the main road, we collapsed in exhaustion, too terrified to speak. The cabin burned to the ground that night. We never spoke of what happened again, not to each other, and certainly not to anyone else. But the experience stayed with us, a shadow in the corners of our minds. Even now, years later, I still feel it sometimes, a cold breath on the back of my neck, a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. We may have left the cabin, but whatever we awakened that summer never truly left us. The moment I arrived in Gettysburg, the air felt heavier, as though the weight of history lingered in every corner of the town. I had always been drawn to places with a rich past, and Gettysburg, steeped in the blood and tragedy of the Civil War, seemed like the perfect destination for a solitary getaway. My plan was to immerse myself in the area's historic charm, visit the battlefields, and maybe even explore a few of the ghost stories that seemed to cling to this town like morning mist. When I checked into the Cedar Grove Inn, a modest but aging hotel just a few miles from the battlefields, I noticed how the receptionist smiled knowingly as she handed me the keys. "Room 213, she said, her voice carrying an odd mix of cheerfulness and caution. "If you hear any bumps in the night, it's probably just the pipes." The hotel itself had a peculiar charm. Its halls were lined with antique portraits, faded wallpaper, and sconces that emitted a dim yellow glow. My room smelled faintly of wood polish and something older, something musty, like a forgotten closet. The bed creaked when I sat down, and the floorboards groaned with every step I took. I didn't mind. It added to the authenticity of the place. I unpacked quickly and set out to explore the town, soaking in the stories and artifacts of a war that had shaped the nation. By evening, I returned to the hotel, exhausted but content. The lobby was deserted except for the receptionist, who was typing away at an ancient computer. As I headed to my room, I passed a stairwell leading down to the basement. A small sign read, "Laundry Room." I paused, my curiosity piqued. I didn't need to do laundry, but something about that dimly lit staircase tugged at me. The light fixture at the bottom flickered erratically, casting strange shadows on the walls. I shook off the unease and made a mental note to check it out later. That night, sleep eluded me. The room was too quiet, the silence broken only by the faint ticking of an unseen clock. Around midnight, I decided to explore the basement. I grabbed my phone, intending to use its flashlight, and made my way down the creaking stairs. The laundry room was small, with just 2 washers and dryers. A faint, metallic smell hung in the air, and the overhead light buzzed faintly. As I stepped inside, the door behind me creaked and then clicked shut. I turned abruptly, but no one was there. The sensation of being watched prickled the back of my neck, but I told myself it was just my imagination. I wandered further into the room, running my hand over the cold metal surface of one of the washers. Then I heard it, a faint knocking sound. At first, I thought it was coming from the pipes, but as I moved closer to the wall, it grew louder and more deliberate, as if someone or something was trying to get my attention. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. The knocking stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding, and hurried up the stairs, telling myself that I had simply let the atmosphere get to me. Still, as I climbed back into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something just beyond the veil of normality. That night, I dreamed of shadows shifting in the basement and cold hands brushing against my skin. When I woke up, I couldn't remember the details, but the unease lingered, curling around me like a fog I couldn't escape. The morning light streamed through the thin curtains, doing little to dispel the lingering heaviness in the air. I tried to shake off the restless night as I dressed and headed to the lobby for coffee. The receptionist from the previous evening greeted me with a polite nod. I considered mentioning the strange sounds in the basement, but decided against it, not wanting to come across as paranoid. After breakfast, I spent the day wandering the battlefields, soaking in the historical gravity of Gettysburg. I joined a guided tour where the stories of soldiers' bravery and sacrifice sent chills down my spine. It was hard not to feel the lingering echoes of the past in this place. As the guide described the horrors of Pickett's charge, I glanced toward the dense woods on the horizon. For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw movement, a figure darting between the trees, but when I looked again, there was nothing. By the time I returned to the Cedar Grove Inn, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the parking lot. I climbed the stairs to my room, my muscles sore from the day's hike. As I approached my door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. My pulse quickened. I was certain I had locked it. Pushing it open cautiously, I peered inside. Nothing seemed out of place. My suitcase was undisturbed, and the bed remained unmade from the morning. Yet a strange, faint smell lingered, like burnt matches. I searched the room but found no evidence of anyone entering. Still, the unease settled deeper into my chest. Later that night, as I lay in bed, the silence in the room felt oppressive again. The clock ticked faintly, a steady rhythm that seemed louder than it should. Then came the sound. At first, it was subtle, a faint tapping, as though someone were lightly drumming their fingers on a table. I sat up, heart racing, straining to hear. The tapping grew louder, morphing into a slow, deliberate knock. It was coming from the wall. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood, hesitating. I traced the sound to the far corner of the room, where the wallpaper was slightly bubbled and faded. Pressing my ear against the wall, I listened, hoping to discern its origin. Suddenly, the knocking stopped, replaced by a soft, dragging noise. It was subtle but unmistakable, the sound of something heavy being moved on the other side. My rational mind told me it was an old building with creaky infrastructure, but my instincts screamed otherwise. Grabbing my phone, I opened the flashlight app and scanned the room. The shadows cast by the beam seemed to stretch unnaturally, as if reluctant to retreat. The light caught movement, a faint flicker near the mirror above the dresser. I froze, staring, waiting for the reflection to betray something lurking behind me. Nothing. But the unease was unbearable. In a desperate attempt to shake off the growing paranoia, I convinced myself to revisit the basement. I needed to prove to myself that it was just an old, noisy hotel. The stairwell leading down was darker than I remembered. My hand trembled as I reached for the light switch. But when I flipped it, nothing happened. The bulb had burned out. Using my phone's flashlight again, I descended cautiously. The air grew colder with each step, and the faint smell of metal returned. When I reached the bottom, the laundry room door creaked open, as if beckoning me inside. The washers and dryers sat silent, their glossy surfaces reflecting the faint beam of my phone. I scanned the room, finding nothing out of place, but then my phone flickered, and the light dimmed. My heart raced as I tapped the screen, trying to bring it back to full brightness. That's when I heard it. A faint whisper, unintelligible but undeniably real. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice breaking. The whispering stopped, replaced by an unbearable silence. The door slammed shut behind me, and the washer nearest to me started on its own, rattling violently as if something inside was trying to escape. I stumbled backward, slamming into the wall as the whispering resumed, louder now, surrounding me. Desperate, I flung the door open and bolted up the stairs, not daring to look back. When I reached my room, I locked the door and collapsed onto the bed, my body trembling. Sleep didn't come that night. I lay in the darkness, the faint sound of knocking echoing in my ears, wondering what I had disturbed. The morning arrived with little comfort. The sunlight streaming through the window did little to chase away the sense of dread that had taken root. I sat at the small table in my room, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee, my hands trembling. The events of the previous night replayed in my mind like a broken record. The whispers, the slamming door, the washer that seemed possessed. It was all too vivid to dismiss as my imagination. Determined to find answers, I decided to confront the hotel staff. Surely someone had experienced something similar or knew the history of this place. The receptionist greeted me with a polite but wary smile as I approached the desk. "Did anyone else report anything unusual last night?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She frowned slightly, her gaze darting to the old guest book on the counter. "Not that I'm aware of," she said, hesitating. "Why? Did something happen?" I recounted the strange occurrences from the basement to the noises in my room. Her expression shifted from polite curiosity to something closer to concern. "You know, some guests do mention odd experiences now and then," she admitted reluctantly. "This building has a long history, and, well, Gettysburg isn't exactly known for peace, even now." "What kind of history?" I pressed. She hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "The Cedar Grove Inn was used as a makeshift field hospital during the Civil War. Many soldiers died here. Some say their spirits never left." She glanced around, as if afraid someone might overhear. "The basement was rumored to be where they stored the bodies before burial. It's just stories, though." Her words only deepened my unease. What if the strange happenings weren't just remnants of the past, but something malevolent tied to the horrors that had occurred here? That evening, I resolved to investigate one last time. If I were to confront whatever haunted this place, it would be on my terms. Armed with a flashlight and a voice recorder app on my phone, I descended into the basement once more, this time prepared to capture evidence. The air felt heavier than before, almost suffocating. I stood in the center of the room, the faint hum of the washer machines the only sound. "If there's anyone here, can you give me a sign?" I called out, my voice trembling. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a low groan reverberated through the walls. The door to the laundry room slammed shut with such force that the sound echoed painfully in my ears. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows that seemed to move independently of the light source. I raised the phone, recording everything. "Who are you? What do you want?" I demanded, fear giving way to desperation. The temperature dropped sharply, my breath visible in the dim beam of light. The whispering began again, louder this time, circling me like an unseen predator. Words emerged from the chaotic murmurs. "Leave this place." My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to move toward the door. It wouldn't budge. Panic surged as I threw my weight against it. Then the washing machine roared to life, rattling violently, its lid flying open. From within, black, viscous liquid spilled out, spreading across the floor like living ink. Shapes began to form in the puddle, faces twisted in agony, mouths open in silent screams. The whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar. Covering my ears, I screamed, "What do you want from me?" The room went silent. The black liquid receded as though being pulled by an invisible force, and the door creaked open on its own. I stumbled out of the basement, heart pounding, and didn't stop running until I reached the safety of my car. I didn't bother to check out formally. I drove away from Gettysburg as fast as I could, the events of the past 2 days replaying in my mind. When I finally stopped at a gas station miles away, I checked the recording on my phone. Most of it was static, but as I fast-forwarded, my heart froze. Amid the static, a voice emerged, clear and chilling. "Never return." I deleted the file immediately and sat there, hands shaking, trying to process what had happened. The Cedar Grove Inn, the whispers, the black liquid, it all felt like a terrible nightmare. But the voice on the recording was proof that it wasn't. Though I escaped the inn, part of me feels like I never truly left. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear faint knocking on the walls of my apartment or feel a sudden chill, as if something followed me. I avoid Gettysburg now, but the memories and the fear linger. Perhaps the spirits there were never at rest, and by stepping into their space, I became part of their endless torment. The evening light filtered through the tall oak trees surrounding my house, casting elongated shadows on the walls. It was peaceful, almost too quiet, except for the occasional bark from Max, my golden retriever, as Sophie ran circles around him in the backyard. Her laughter carried through the open kitchen window, a comforting sound on what should have been an uneventful Friday evening. I had spent the better part of the day preparing for her visit, ensuring her favorite snacks were stocked, and the guest room was cozy enough for her. Sophie was my 9-year-old niece, brimming with energy and endless curiosity. Her parents, my sister Emily and her boyfriend Matt, had recently moved to California, chasing new opportunities. They left Sophie in my care for the weekend, promising to call once they settled into their new home. "Dinner's almost ready," I called, stirring a pot of spaghetti. "Okay," Sophie shouted back. As the evening progressed, the shadows outside deepened, and a creeping sense of isolation began to settle over the house. I shook it off as my own overactive imagination, a side effect of living so close to the woods. Sophie, oblivious to my unease, sat cross-legged on the living room floor, flipping through a picture book while Max sprawled lazily at her feet. It wasn't until Sophie turned to me, her face alight with curiosity, that the first unsettling moment occurred. "Aunt Melissa," she said, tilting her head, "why didn't you tell me Emily and Matt were coming over?" I froze, the pasta spoon clattering onto the counter. "What are you talking about?" "They were at the front door," she said matter-of-factly, pointing. I waved at them, but they didn't come in. A chill ran down my spine. Emily and Matt were thousands of miles away. I tried to keep my voice steady. "Sweetheart, Emily and Matt are in California. Are you sure it was them?" Sophie frowned. "It looked just like them. They smiled at me." I glanced toward the front door, my heart hammering. Max, who had been dozing moments before, now stood alert, ears pricked and body tense. He let out a low growl, staring at the door as if he could see something I couldn't. "Stay here," I instructed Sophie, grabbing my phone and approaching the door cautiously. The porch light flickered as I peeked through the peephole. Nothing. Just the dark expanse of my quiet neighborhood. I exhaled shakily and locked the door, double-checking the deadbolt. When I turned around, Sophie was watching me with wide eyes, her book forgotten on the floor. "They were there," she insisted. I forced a smile, trying to mask my growing unease. "It's probably your imagination. Maybe you're just tired." Sophie didn't look convinced, but she didn't argue. Instead, she curled up on the couch with Max, who continued to watch the door, growling intermittently. I busied myself with the dishes, pretending everything was fine, but the flickering lights and Max's uncharacteristic behavior left me on edge. By the time Sophie went to bed, the house was unnervingly quiet. I tucked her in, kissed her forehead, and tried to reassure myself that her claim was nothing more than a child's fanciful imagination. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Later that night, as I sat on the couch scrolling through my phone, a faint tapping sound broke the silence. I froze, my ears straining. It came again, more insistent this time, tapping against the living room window. I turned slowly, my pulse racing, but the curtains obscured my view. Max was already at the window, his fur bristling and teeth bared. He barked furiously, the sound echoing through the house. Gathering my courage, I approached the window and pulled the curtain back just enough to peek outside. The yard was empty, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. Yet the tapping continued, now at the kitchen window. Adrenaline surged through me as I rushed to check the locks, ensuring every door and window was secure. Max followed me closely, his growls low and menacing. I wanted to dismiss it as the wind or an overactive imagination, but deep down I knew something was out there. I finally retreated to my bedroom, leaving the hallway light on for comfort. Max settled at the foot of my bed, his watchful eyes fixed on the door. Despite my best efforts to calm my racing thoughts, sleep eluded me. Somewhere in the house, the faint tapping continued, relentless and rhythmic, like a sinister lullaby. Morning arrived, but the sunlight did little to erase the unease from the night before. Sophie's laughter in the kitchen offered a brief reprieve as I forced myself to focus on breakfast, pushing the events of the night to the back of my mind. Max seemed calmer too, though his occasional glances toward the living room hinted that he hadn't forgotten. "What's the plan for today?" Sophie asked, her face sticky with syrup. I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. I wanted to keep things normal for her, but my thoughts kept circling back to the tapping sounds and her insistence that she'd seen Emily and Matt. "Maybe we'll take Max for a walk later," I said, forcing a smile. Sophie nodded enthusiastically, her childlike energy undeterred by the tension I felt simmering beneath the surface. As I cleaned up after breakfast, my phone buzzed on the counter. I grabbed it, hoping for a distraction, but the screen displayed an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. At first, there was only static, a low, crackling hum that sent a shiver down my spine. Then, faintly, I heard a voice. Emily's voice. "Melissa." I froze. The tone was distorted, as if coming from a great distance, but unmistakable. "Emily?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The line went dead. My hands trembled as I set the phone down. Max had stopped chewing on his toy and was staring at me, his ears alert. Sophie, oblivious, hummed to herself as she drew at the kitchen table. I decided not to mention the call, though the unease settled deep in my chest. Later that afternoon, we ventured out for a walk, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. The quiet suburban streets felt safer, their familiarity a comforting contrast to the strange occurrences at home. Max trotted ahead, his leash taut, while Sophie skipped beside me, her ponytail bouncing with every step. It was during our walk that Sophie stopped suddenly, her eyes fixed on a house across the street. "They're there," she whispered. "Who?" I asked, following her gaze. "Emily and Matt," she said, pointing toward the porch of the vacant house. My stomach twisted as I looked. The house had been empty for months, its windows boarded up and the lawn overgrown. Yet, Sophie's conviction was unshakable. "They waved at me again," she said, her voice tinged with both excitement and confusion. I tried to steady my breathing. "Sophie, it's not them. Remember? They moved to California." Sophie frowned, her brows furrowed, but it looked just like them. I tugged at Max's leash, urging us to keep moving. The tension clung to me like a second skin, every sound and shadow amplifying my paranoia. When we returned home, Sophie retreated to the living room with her coloring books while I tried to focus on work. But my concentration was broken by Max, who stood at the base of the stairs, growling softly. "What is it, boy?" I asked, my voice shaking. Max didn't move, his gaze fixed on the top of the stairs. Summoning my courage, I ascended the steps, every creak of the wooden floorboards echoing in the stillness. The hallway was empty, but the air felt heavier, oppressive. As I passed Sophie's room, a faint sound caught my attention. Whispering. I froze, pressing my ear to the door. The whispers were indistinct, like a conversation just out of reach. Slowly, I opened the door, half expecting to find Sophie playing a game. But the room was empty, the bed neatly made. The whispers stopped. A cold draft brushed against my neck, and I turned abruptly, heart pounding. The hallway behind me was empty, but I could feel it. Something was there, watching. Downstairs, Sophie called for me, her voice breaking the spell. I rushed back, trying to shake the lingering chill. As the sun began to set, I locked the doors and drew the curtains, determined to keep whatever was out there at bay. But deep down, I knew the house wouldn't hold it for long. That night, as Sophie slept, the tapping returned, louder and more insistent. This time, it wasn't just the windows, it was the walls, the doors surrounding us. The tapping turned into a relentless drumming, echoing through every corner of the house. I stood in the living room, heart racing, as Max barked furiously at the front door. Sophie, awakened by the noise, clung to me, her small hands trembling. "What's happening, Aunt Melissa?" she whispered, her voice shaking. I had no answer. Every rational thought I tried to cling to was drowned out by the growing cacophony. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but the screen was blank, refusing to respond. The lights flickered, then died, plunging us into darkness. "Stay close," I said, clutching Sophie's hand tightly. Max growled low in his throat, his body stiff with tension. I fumbled for a flashlight in the kitchen drawer, its beam weak but enough to guide us. The noise suddenly stopped. The silence was deafening, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Max's ears perked up, and he let out a low whine, his eyes darting toward the hallway. "Wait here," I told Sophie, kneeling to look her in the eyes. "No matter what, don't leave this spot." She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. I handed her the flashlight and picked up a kitchen knife, the cold steel offering little comfort. Max and I crept toward the hallway, the air growing colder with each step. My breath came in shallow gasps as I approached the stairs. A faint light glowed at the top, flickering like a candle. As I ascended, the familiar sound of whispers returned, louder and clearer now. It was Emily's voice. "Melissa, help us," it pleaded, mingling with a deeper male voice I couldn't recognize. I reached the landing and froze. Emily and Matt stood in the doorway of the guest room, their faces pale and eyes wide. But there was something wrong, too wrong. Their features flickered, like static on an old TV, and their expressions seemed frozen in a twisted mix of fear and pain. "Emily," I managed to choke out. Her lips moved, but her voice didn't match. "Leave, now." The male figure stepped forward, his face darkened by shadows. "You shouldn't have stayed," he growled, his voice echoing unnaturally. Max barked ferociously, snapping me out of my paralysis. I stumbled backward, nearly losing my grip on the knife. The figures began to distort, their shapes elongating unnaturally. A black mist seeped from the edges of the room, crawling toward me. I turned and bolted down the stairs, Max hot on my heels. Sophie was still in the kitchen, her flashlight casting jittery beams of light as she whimpered in fear. "They're upstairs," I said, grabbing her hand. "We have to go. Now." Without pausing to grab anything, I yanked the front door open, dragging Sophie and Max into the cool night air. As we stumbled onto the lawn, I turned to look back. The house loomed ominously, every window dark except for the faint flicker of that ghostly light upstairs. A figure appeared at the window, a distorted, shadowy outline that watched us as we fled. The whispering continued, even outside, faint but persistent, seeping into my thoughts. We ran to the neighbor's house, pounding on the door until a groggy older man answered. His confused expression turned to concern when he saw us. "There's something in my house," I blurted, barely able to string the words together. "We need to call the police." He ushered us inside and made the call. Minutes later, flashing lights illuminated the street, and 2 officers arrived. I explained everything, though I could tell by their skeptical looks that they didn't believe me. They searched the house but found no signs of anyone. No footprints, no lights, no evidence of the tapping or whispers. They wrote it off as a prank or my imagination running wild. But I knew the truth. Sophie's unwavering insistence, Max's behavior, and what I had seen with my own eyes couldn't be dismissed. We didn't go back that night. Instead, we stayed at a motel, the sterile, impersonal room offering a strange sense of safety. Sophie fell asleep quickly, that exhausted from the ordeal, while Max curled up at the foot of the bed, his body still tense. I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the motel room sent my heart racing. When I finally closed my eyes, the whispers returned, faint but unmistakable, promising that it wasn't over. We left the house for good the next day. I hired movers to pack our belongings while Sophie and I stayed far away. Weeks passed, and though life began to return to normal, the unease never left me. One evening, while unpacking boxes in our new home, I found an old photograph of Emily and Matt. My hand trembled as I stared at it. Behind them, faint but visible, was the outline of the same shadowy figure I had seen in the window. I had always enjoyed the walk home after a long day at work. There was something soothing about the quiet streets, the distant hum of cars on the main road, and the soft glow of streetlights against the night sky. The neighborhood was calm, the kind of place where people greeted each other by name and kids rode their bikes on weekends. Yet tonight, something felt wrong. It started subtly. As I left the office, the usual fatigue weighed on my shoulders, but there was a sharpness to the air, a chill that I couldn't explain. I shook it off and took my usual route, weaving through the well-lit avenues that connected the city center to my residential street. The first few blocks were uneventful, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Then I noticed him. It was just a glimpse at first, a man in a dark coat standing at the corner where the street lamp flickered. He was still, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his face obscured by the shadow of a nearby tree. I thought nothing of it at the time. After all, it was a public street, and people stood around all the time, waiting for friends or a ride. But as I walked on, I became aware of his presence. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly behind me, matching my pace almost perfectly. I glanced over my shoulder. He was there, always at the edge of my vision, keeping a steady distance. My heart started to race, and I told myself it was nothing. Just a coincidence. Maybe he lived in the same direction. To ease my nerves, I decided to change my route, turning down an unfamiliar side street that cut through a small park. The footsteps behind me faltered for a moment, and I felt a brief wave of relief. But then they resumed, louder this time, as though he had quickened his pace to catch up. I clenched my fists, my breath coming in shallow bursts. The park was eerily quiet, the path illuminated only by dim, infrequent lights. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears as I scanned the area for any sign of help. A lone bench, a couple of trees swaying in the wind, but no one else in sight. Halfway through the park, I stopped abruptly and turned around. The man froze about 30 feet away. He didn't move, didn't speak. His face was still hidden, but I could feel his eyes on me, cold and unyielding. I wanted to shout, to demand what he wanted, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I stared at him, trying to mask my fear with a defiance I didn't feel. After what felt like an eternity, he took a step forward. It was slow, deliberate. That single motion sent a jolt of terror through me, and I turned and bolted. My legs moved on pure instinct, carrying me as fast as they could down the path. I didn't look back. I burst out of the park onto another residential street, my chest heaving. I had no idea if he was still following me. The street was empty, save for the occasional parked car and a few houses with their porch lights on. I spotted a small convenience store up ahead and made a beeline for it. My last shred of logic telling me that being around people would keep me safe. The bell above the door jingled as I entered, and the fluorescent lights felt harsh after the dimness of the park. A young cashier looked up from his phone and gave me a polite nod. I grabbed a random item from a shelf, chips, I think, and walked to the counter, trying to compose myself. "Late night?" the cashier asked as he scanned the bag. His voice was friendly, but I barely registered it. My eyes darted to the window, scanning the street outside. There he was, standing under the glow of a street lamp across the road, his figure unmistakable. He didn't approach, didn't make any move to come inside. He just stood there, waiting. My stomach churned and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. "Something wrong?" the cashier asked, his brow furrowing. I forced a smile and shook my head, handing over a few crumpled bills. "No, it's fine," I muttered. He gave me my change and wished me a good night, but I barely heard him as I stepped back outside. The man hadn't moved. His head turned slightly in my direction as I exited, and though I couldn't see his face, I knew he was watching me. For a moment, I considered going back inside the store and calling the police. But what would I say? That a man was following me? That he hadn't actually done anything but scare me? Instead, I turned down another street, walking briskly, almost jogging. My house wasn't far now, just a few blocks. If I could make it there, I'd be safe. That's what I told myself as the sound of his footsteps returned, steady and unrelenting, like a metronome ticking away at my sanity. As I turned the corner toward my neighborhood, the familiar houses lining the street should have brought a sense of comfort. Yet, the oppressive weight of his footsteps behind me shattered any hope of relief. My pulse pounded in my ears as I quickened my pace. I dared to glance over my shoulder, but he was gone. The street was empty, eerily quiet, as though the world had paused in anticipation of some unseen horror. For a fleeting moment, I convinced myself it was over. Maybe he had lost interest, or perhaps I had imagined his pursuit. My mind, desperate for normalcy, latched onto these thoughts, even as the knot in my stomach tightened. I reached my house, fumbling with my keys, my hands trembling so violently that they slipped twice before I managed to unlock the door. Once inside, I bolted the door and leaned against it, my breath ragged. The silence of my home felt unnaturally thick, every creak and groan of the old structure amplified in the stillness. The living room light cast long shadows across the walls, and I hesitated before peering out the window. He was there, standing at the end of my driveway, his figure silhouetted by the faint glow of the street lamp. My heart plummeted. He had followed me here. My sanctuary, my haven, no longer felt safe. My mind raced with questions. Who was he? What did he want? And why me? I reached for my phone, my fingers flying over the screen as I dialed 911. The operator's calm voice was a lifeline as I explained my situation, though I could barely keep the tremor out of my words. She assured me that an officer was on the way and told me to stay inside. Hanging up, I paced the room, stealing glances out the window. He hadn't moved, standing as still as a statue, his head tilted slightly as though he was listening for something. The oppressive feeling of being watched made my skin crawl. I double-checked all the locks and turned off the lights, hoping the darkness would make me less visible. Minutes felt like hours as I waited. My mind conjured scenarios, each more terrifying than the last. What if he tried to break in? What if the police didn't arrive in time? The sound of a car engine jolted me from my spiraling thoughts, and I rushed to the window. A patrol car pulled up in front of my house, its flashing lights slicing through the darkness. Relief washed over me as an officer stepped out and approached the man. I watched intently, my breath held as the officer shone his flashlight on the figure. But then, the man was gone. The officer waved his light around, illuminating the empty street. My heart sank. How could he have disappeared so quickly? The officer knocked on my door moments later, and I hesitated before opening it. "Are you the one who called?" he asked, his voice steady and professional. "Yes," I stammered. He was just there, standing at the end of the driveway. The officer nodded, stepping back to survey the area. "I didn't see anyone. Are you sure it wasn't a misunderstanding?" I felt a rush of frustration and desperation. "I'm sure. He followed me home. I saw him standing right there." The officer took a step closer, his expression softening. "We'll patrol the area, but it's possible someone was just passing through and decided to mess with you. If you see anything else, call us immediately." He left, his patrol car disappearing into the night. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, staring at the empty street. Doubt crept into my mind. Had I overreacted? Was it all in my head? The man had been there. Of that I was certain. But now, in the stillness, it felt like trying to hold on to a fleeting nightmare. I closed the door and locked it again, double-checking each bolt. Exhaustion set in, but sleep was the furthest thing from my mind. I sat on the couch, staring at the shadows playing across the walls, every creak of the house sending a jolt through me. Then I heard it, a faint tapping at the window. I froze, my heart slamming against my ribs. The tapping came again, slow and deliberate. Gathering every ounce of courage I had, I crept toward the window, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight. The curtain swayed slightly in the breeze of the air vent, and I reached out with a shaking hand to pull it back. Nothing. The street outside was empty, the soft glow of the street lamp casting long shadows over the pavement. I stared for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something, anything, to confirm what I'd heard. But there was nothing there. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The days that followed blurred together, each one marked by an unshakable sense of unease. I tried to return to my routine, convincing myself that the strange events were nothing more than an unfortunate coincidence, or at worst, a figment of my imagination. Yet, the feeling of being watched lingered. It clung to me, a shadow that refused to be left behind. Every time I left the house, I found myself scanning the streets, expecting to see him. Nights were worse. The creaks and groans of my old home seemed louder, more deliberate, as if the house itself was conspiring against me. Sleep came in short, restless bursts, and when I did dream, it was always of him, his silhouette standing motionless under the street lamp. On the third night after the encounter, I woke abruptly, my body drenched in sweat. The house was eerily silent, the kind of silence that amplifies every small sound. I strained my ears, certain something had pulled me from my sleep, but the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator. Then I heard it, a knock at the front door. It was soft at first, almost hesitant, but then it came again, louder this time. My breath hitched as I sat frozen in my bed. Who would be at my door in the middle of the night? My phone was on the nightstand, and I reached for it, my hand trembling. Dialing 911 felt like the only logical choice, but I hesitated. What would I say? That someone knocked on my door? The knocking came again, steady and deliberate. This time it was accompanied by a faint shuffling and like someone shifting their weight from one foot to the other. Swallowing hard, I crept to the window overlooking the front yard and peeked through the blinds. There he was. He stood on the porch, his figure illuminated by the pale glow of the porch light. His head was tilted slightly as if listening for something. I watched as his hand reached out to knock again, and a chill ran down my spine. He knew I was inside. Adrenaline coursed through me, and I backed away from the window, nearly tripping over a chair in the process. My phone slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor. The noise seemed deafening in the stillness, and I held my breath, waiting to see if he'd react. The knocking stopped. Heart pounding, I waited, each second stretching into an eternity. The shuffling resumed, quieter this time, moving along the side of the house. I heard the faint crunch of gravel as he stepped into the backyard. Panic surged through me, and I forced myself to move. Grabbing the phone, I dialed 911. My voice trembling as I whispered my address to the operator. She assured me that officers were on their way, but it felt like an empty promise. The sound of footsteps outside grew louder, and then I heard the back door handle rattle. My blood ran cold. I hadn't locked it. I cursed myself for the oversight, scrambling to find something, anything to barricade the door. My hands closed around a chair, and I dragged it to the door, wedging it under the handle just as the door swung open an inch. The pressure against the door increased, and I threw my weight against it, praying the chair would hold. "Go away!" I screamed, my voice cracking. The door stilled for a moment, but then the force returned, more insistent this time. Red and blue lights flooded the windows, and the sound of a police car screeching to a halt in front of the house was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. The rattling stopped abruptly, and I heard the sound of hurried footsteps retreating into the night. By the time the officers arrived at the back door, he was gone. They searched the area, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, but there was no sign of him. One officer stayed to take my statement while the others continued the search. I recounted everything, my words tumbling out in a panicked rush. When they left, the house felt emptier than ever. I locked every door and window, but the sense of safety I once took for granted was gone. He had been inside my backyard, inches away from me. The thought haunted me. The following weeks were a haze of anxiety and hypervigilance. I installed cameras, replaced the locks, and even adopted a dog, hoping its presence would bring some measure of comfort. But the damage was done. The man had taken something intangible from me, my sense of security, my peace of mind. I never saw him again, but his absence did little to ease my fear. Every shadow, every creak of the house became him. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting. And though life moved on, I knew I would never truly be the same. I remember that last Thanksgiving like a fragmented dream, where vivid colors and chilling whispers collide in a haze of memory. Our house stood on the edge of a sprawling forest in Vermont, shrouded in the kind of mist that swallowed sound. From the outside, it was picturesque, wooden beams, a cobblestone path leading to the porch, but inside it was a monument to my family's obsession. Every room bore relics of Arthurian legend, tapestries of knights in battle, replicas of crowns and swords, and the centerpiece, an ornate replica of Excalibur mounted above the fireplace. I was 10, wide-eyed and ignorant, believing every tale my mother told me about the honor and destiny tied to our bloodline. My cousins and I would chase each other through the hallways, only vaguely aware of the hushed conversations among the adults. They spoke in riddles, their voices heavy with purpose. That Thanksgiving morning was no different. The aroma of roasted turkey filled the air, but the atmosphere was taut with an unspoken tension. "Stay out of the study," my father warned as I dashed past, the door to the room shut tight. My cousins and I exchanged curious glances, but obeyed. The study was forbidden, especially on Thanksgiving. It was where the adults prepared for what they called the ceremony. Dinner was a spectacle. The table stretched endlessly, adorned with candelabras and dishes that glittered like treasures. My family, dressed in formal attire, raised their glasses and synchronized toasts. I remember my uncle reciting something in Old English, his voice trembling as though invoking something sacred. My mother clutched my hand tightly, her nails digging into my skin as if afraid I'd vanish. After the feast, the mood shifted. My cousins and I were herded upstairs. "Stay in your rooms," my aunt instructed firmly. It wasn't unusual. Thanksgiving always ended with the adults retreating to the basement for what they claimed was a tradition. This time, though, I couldn't contain my curiosity. The whispers from the study earlier had planted a seed of unease. I crept out of my room, careful not to wake my cousins. The house was eerily silent except for the faint hum of voices coming from below. The basement door, usually locked, was slightly ajar. My heart raced as I descended the stairs, the wood creaking under my bare feet. Shadows flickered on the stone walls, cast by candles arranged in a circle. In the center stood Excalibur, gleaming ominously. The adults were gathered, their faces solemn. My father held the sword, his hands trembling. My uncle chanted in a guttural language, and the others joined in, their voices rising in unison. My mother knelt at the edge of the circle, tears streaming down her face. I wanted to call out to her, but my voice caught in my throat. Then I saw it, my older cousin Luke standing in the center of the circle, his expression blank. My father raised the sword high, and the chanting reached a fever pitch. Panic surged through me. What were they doing? Before I could scream, the blade came down. I turned and ran, my mind reeling. As I reached the top of the stairs, a loud crash shook the house, followed by shouting and chaos. I froze, torn between terror and curiosity. Heavy footsteps stormed into the basement. I heard screams, but they weren't coming from my family. I hid behind the banister as strangers burst into the room, their flashlights piercing the darkness. The chanting stopped abruptly, replaced by violent scuffles. One of the men shouted, "Drop the weapon." My father's voice boomed in defiance, and then there was a gunshot. I don't remember much after that. The strangers carried me out of the house, their faces grim. I looked back to see flames licking the edges of the basement window. The last thing I saw was Excalibur, glowing in the firelight like something alive. That night, everything I believed shattered. I never saw most of my family again. What I didn't understand then was that the worst scars weren't from what I witnessed. They came from the questions that haunted me for years after. Who were those people? Why did they come, and why did they leave me alive? Years later, I found myself standing in the ruins of that house, the memories clawing at my mind like shadows I couldn't escape. The fire had consumed the basement entirely, leaving only charred remains and the skeletal frame of the rest of the house. I was no longer a scared 10-year-old. I had grown into someone hardened, my life defined by the questions I couldn't answer and the nightmares I couldn't shake. Every Thanksgiving since that night, I would wake drenched in sweat, haunted by the image of my father raising Excalibur and the strangers bursting in with shouts and flashlights. The town had forgotten about my family. Or rather, they chose to. Whenever I tried to ask questions, I was met with silence or vague platitudes. It didn't matter if it was the local sheriff, my few remaining relatives, or even strangers at the diner where I sometimes ate. They all pretended that nothing happened, but I could see the unease in their eyes when I brought up the fire. It was as if the town collectively decided to bury the memory, and with it, the truth. It wasn't until I turned 25 that I stumbled upon my first lead. It came in the form of a faded newspaper clipping I found while sifting through the few belongings salvaged from the house. The article was brief, buried in the back pages. Unidentified armed group intervenes in mysterious ritual. It mentioned the fire, the deaths of several family members, and a militia group that disrupted the events. The words felt like acid on my skin. A militia? That didn't explain the coordinated manner of the raid or the precision with which they dismantled my family's so-called ceremony. These weren't vigilantes. They were something more organized, more deliberate. The clipping listed no names, only vague references to interveners. Frustrated but determined, I turned to the internet. Months of digging led me to a name, Victor Kane. He was mentioned in a conspiracy forum, tied to clandestine operations across the country. The posts suggested he was connected to an organization that sought to eradicate dangerous cults. My heart raced as I scrolled through grainy photos, and then I found it, a picture of him from that night. He was younger, his face lit by the beam of his flashlight, the same expression of grim determination I remembered as he pulled me out of the house. I knew what I had to do. I tracked Kane to a small town in upstate New York, a far cry from the idyllic Vermont countryside where my family had lived. The place was quiet, almost too perfect. The kind of town where everyone knew everyone, and outsiders like me stood out. I rented a room in a rundown motel and spent days watching him. He worked as a handyman, blending into the community with ease. To them, he was just another friendly neighbor. To me, he was the man who destroyed my family. The first time I saw him in person, I froze. He was older now, his hair streaked with gray, but his presence was no less imposing. My mind flooded with memories of that night, of his voice shouting commands and the look of disgust on his face as he stared at my family's ritual. I wanted to confront him right then and there to demand answers, but something held me back. It wasn't fear. It was the realization that I wasn't ready. Not yet. Instead, I started to follow him, piecing together his routine. He lived alone in a modest house on the edge of town, surrounded by woods that reminded me too much of my childhood home. Every evening, he sat on his porch, sipping coffee and staring into the trees as if waiting for something or someone. It was during one of these surveillance sessions that I noticed a pattern. Every Thursday, he would leave town, driving an unmarked van with a heavy lock on the back. I followed him once, keeping a safe distance. He drove for hours, finally stopping at a decrepit warehouse on the outskirts of a larger city. I watched as he unloaded crates from the van, each one marked with strange symbols. He wasn't just a handyman, he was still involved in something far darker. As I drove back to the motel that night, my mind raced. What was Kane still hiding? And how was it connected to that night? One thing was certain, I wasn't going to let him slip away again. I waited until the next Thursday to act. The plan had formed in my mind like a storm cloud, and there was no turning back. This time, when Victor Kane left his house in the unmarked van, I followed, keeping far enough behind that he wouldn't notice. My heartbeat thundered as I gripped the wheel, rehearsing the confrontation over and over in my head. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about closure, about finally uncovering the truth. He led me back to the same warehouse I had seen the week before. I parked my car out of sight, hidden by the skeletal remains of an old service station nearby. The evening sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the concrete expanse. I crept closer, my footsteps barely audible over the crunch of gravel. Kane was unloading crates again, his movements deliberate and methodical. I stepped out from the shadows and called his name. He froze, his body stiffening as he turned to face me. His eyes narrowed in recognition. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of warning. "I need answers," I replied, trying to steady my voice. "You were there that night. You know what happened to my family." He set the crate down and took a step closer. The look in his eyes was unreadable, somewhere between pity and caution. "You think you're ready for the truth? That it'll give you peace? It won't. Try me." I shot back, the anger bubbling to the surface. "You destroyed everything. I deserve to know why." Kane sighed and gestured for me to follow him inside the warehouse. The interior was as decrepit as the outside, with broken windows and the smell of damp concrete. He led me to a corner where a single desk sat under the harsh glow of a flickering fluorescent light. On it were files, photographs, and what appeared to be maps. "Your family," he began, "wasn't what you think they were. The rituals, the obsession with Excalibur, they weren't just delusions. They were preparing for something dangerous." I scoffed, refusing to believe his justification. "You're saying they deserve to die?" "No," he replied sharply, "but their actions put others at risk. The sword wasn't just a symbol to them. They believed it held real power, and they were willing to sacrifice anyone to awaken it." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Memories of that night came flooding back. The chanting, the blood, the look of wild fervor in my father's eyes. For years, I had convinced myself that my family had been victims. Now, doubt began to creep in, eroding the foundation of everything I thought I knew. "You're lying," I whispered, though even I wasn't convinced. Kane slid a file across the desk toward me. "See for yourself." I hesitated before picking it up. Inside were photographs of my family's gatherings, images of hooded figures, strange symbols drawn on the ground, and most disturbingly, people bound and gagged. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages. each one more damning than the last. They were going to sacrifice you, Cain said, his voice low. You were meant to be the final offering. I staggered back, the room spinning around me. It couldn't be true. My father, my family, they couldn't have planned something so monstrous. But the evidence was there, staring back at me in black and white. Why did you save me? I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Because you were innocent, he said. A child caught in something you couldn't control. The rage that had fueled me for years began to dissipate, replaced by a hollow, gnawing emptiness. Cain wasn't the villain I had imagined him to be. He had saved me from a fate I couldn't comprehend, and now I was left with the unbearable weight of the truth. As I turned to leave, he stopped me. There's one more thing, he said, handing me a small wrapped bundle. Inside was a fragment of the sword, the tip of Excalibur broken off during that fateful night. Take it, a reminder of what you survived and of what you must never let happen again. I drove back to the ruins of my childhood home, the fragment heavy in my hands. Standing there amidst the ashes, I realized that vengeance wouldn't heal the wounds I carried. The truth was my burden now, a scar that would never fade, but it was also a reminder. I had survived the fire, the rituals, and the lies. I had been spared, not for revenge, but to ensure the past would never repeat itself.